At 8:16 a.m. on August 6, 1945, Hiroshima didn't send a warning. It didn't call for help. It just went silent. And the first message that hit Tokyo wasn't atomic bomb. It was smaller, stranger. Hiroshima is off the air. For a few minutes, nobody understood what that meant. Then the phones didn't work. Then the telegraph died. Then the city couldn't be reached at all. That delay, confusion, denial, people telling themselves, "This can't be real," cost hours. And those hours almost cost thousands more lives. Because Japan didn't just hesitate after Hiroshima. Days later, it nearly happened again, inside the Imperial Palace. In this video, you'll see how Japan didn't understand Hiroshima at first, and how they nearly lost the one recording that ended World War II, when soldiers stormed the palace to steal the emperor's surrender message and keep the war alive. Because the war was over on paper, but it still had to survive the night. The first message wasn't atomic bomb. It was much smaller and much weirder. Hiroshima is off the air. Tokyo's control operators noticed it right away. But radio stations often stopped broadcasting during air raid alerts, so nobody screamed. Hiroshima had sounded an all-clear at 005, and then another alert came at 0709, just before the blast. So silence by itself didn't feel like proof of disaster. What puzzled headquarters was the total blackout. They tried to reconnect by phone. Nothing. Then the telegraph line went dead about 20 minutes after the bombing. Tokyo's railroad center confirmed disruption north of Hiroshima. The army control station in the city couldn't be reached, even after repeated calls. That's when the confusion started to grow teeth. Small, unofficial reports began dripping in from railway stops within about 10 miles. People described a terrible explosion near the city. Some reports said bombs seemed to explode before reaching the ground, which didn't match the usual impact patterns. Still, the first instinct inside Japanese military headquarters wasn't fear, it was doubt. They looked at the logic and told themselves the rumors didn't add up. In their minds, there was no large enemy raid on radar. Hiroshima had no giant explosive stockpile that could wipe out the whole city. The normal patterns of conventional bombing weren't there. The all-clear had even been given shortly before the blast. So they treated the reports like exaggerations and sent a young officer to investigate what they assumed was an overblown story. This is the key problem. Atomic weapons had no pattern they recognized. Nothing in their planning explained how one weapon could do what whole waves of bombers usually did. With no framework to understand it, their brains reached for the safest idea. It couldn't be real. After Hiroshima, Tokyo radio stayed eerily quiet for 16 hours. Behind that silence, leadership was trying to understand reports that sounded like science fiction. The official acknowledgement did not come quickly. The High Command didn't want to admit, especially in public, that a single American bomb could erase a major city. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki began to grasp the gravity only after scientific investigation showed it was not a normal bombing attack. Even then, the response was reluctant. Many leaders treated Hiroshima like an isolated event, not a sign that the whole war had changed. Inside the army, the first reaction was hard denial. When early reports reached Tokyo, many leaders refused to believe the United States had this technology. Their words were blunt. It was technically impossible. This wasn't only stubborn pride, it was genuine shock at a leap they couldn't picture. Even as evidence piled up, they clung to their main plan for ending the war on their terms. Kyūjō, the homeland defense plan meant to bleed the Americans so badly they would negotiate. But the reality on the ground was already screaming. The staff officer who reached Hiroshima saw a massive smoke cloud rising from a city that had been smashed flat. Communication blackouts were not normal. Yet the leadership still hesitated, because admitting the truth meant admitting their whole plan was now outdated. The Imperial Navy reacted differently. They were stunned, but they moved quickly from disbelief to cold analysis. Naval intelligence estimated the bomb's yield at 16 kilotons. They noted the detonation point with precision, about 240 meters from IOE Bridge above the Shima Surgical Clinic. They estimated the civilian death toll between 90,000 and 120,000. But here's what's so hard to understand. Even with those numbers, they did not instantly jump to surrender. They tried to fit Hiroshima into their existing war logic. They placed it beside conventional bombing patterns, like it was just another extreme data point. They also noted how their fighters had failed to intercept the high-altitude B-29s, and they had been avoiding engaging those bombers since April, partly to preserve aircraft for the expected invasion. Meanwhile, naval ships were stuck in port because fuel shortages were so severe they couldn't move. Even after Hiroshima, the Navy kept prioritizing Operation Kyūjō preparations. They convinced themselves the Americans might have only 1 or 2 more atomic bombs. That belief was tragically wrong. Emperor Hirohito learned about Hiroshima about 12 hours after the blast. You might expect an immediate explosive reaction. Instead, his first response was muted. Privately, he could see the war could not go on forever, but he did not immediately accept surrender with no deal. Hirohito still hoped the Soviets might help negotiate peace, some deal that could end the war without destroying the throne. His biggest concern wasn't only the bomb, it was the emperor's position, because the Potsdam Declaration did not guarantee it. Then the second shock hit. On August 8, 1945, Soviet Foreign Commissar Vyacheslav Molotov told Japanese Ambassador Naotake Sato that the USSR would declare war against Japan, effective August 9th. Stalin had promised the Allies he would enter the Pacific War 3 months after Germany's defeat, so the timing wasn't random. But for Japan, it was crushing. Japan had been counting on Soviet neutrality. Some leaders even hoped the USSR could help negotiate better surrender terms. Instead, Japan now faced a 2-front crisis: American atomic attacks from the air and huge Soviet forces pushing in from the west. The Soviet message referenced Japan's rejection of the Potsdam terms, demanding unconditional surrender. The Soviet government framed their choice as necessary to reduce suffering for the Japanese people, comparing it to what Germany faced after refusing to give in. For Japanese leaders, it meant their last diplomatic hope was gone. The Soviet attack also exposed a hard truth about Japan's military strength by August 1945. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria had once been elite. Now it was a shell. Many units existed mostly on paper. Combat readiness was below 15%. The best equipment had been moved to other fronts. When the Soviets launched Operation August Storm on August 9th, the outcome was brutal and fast. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops, backed by modern armor, smashed through Japanese defenses. They used paratroopers to seize key positions ahead of ground forces. Japanese units were overwhelmed. Within days, the Kwantung Army was shattered. Around 80,000 casualties, about 54,000 prisoners, and hundreds of officers captured. The army, tied to horrors like Unit 731, collapsed into a disorganized mass of surrendering soldiers. This collapse, happening alongside the atomic bombings, wiped out any remaining hope of Soviet help and exposed new paths toward Japan's homeland. For Japan's top leaders, this two-front disaster made continued resistance harder to defend. And then August 9th slammed into Japan like a second hammer. On the same day, Nagasaki was bombed, and the Soviet Union declared war. The last excuses collapsed. Until Nagasaki, it's shocking but true, many leaders still doubted Hiroshima. They told themselves America couldn't have more than one bomb, or couldn't use them close together. Even the Navy High Command had circulated assessments claiming US bombs were limited. Nagasaki ended that fantasy. Foreign Minister Togo called August 9th a bad day, which sounds almost polite for what happened. A second city destroyed and Soviet neutrality dead. Togo had already been pushing for surrender after Hiroshima. He urged the emperor to end the war quickly after learning about the destruction and after intercepting the Americans' announcement about their new weapon. He pushed Prime Minister Suzuki to convene the Supreme War Council to discuss Hiroshima. Then the Soviet news hit and crushed the strategy he had built around Moscow. Togo had signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in April 1941. Now he watched it collapse in the worst possible way. So he pivoted hard. He pushed to accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition: the emperor stays on the throne. He made that point bluntly to Privy Seal Koichi Kido, saying surrender with no deal was basically unavoidable. And the silence he received back said everything. His urgency showed in his messages to Ambassador Sato, including a wire on August 7th that revealed he knew Japan's options were vanishing. His diplomatic efforts were also boxed in, because Japan's diplomats often had little real authority, something later revealed through decrypted cables. Prime Minister Suzuki's message was simple: let us end the war. But the leadership machine didn't move smoothly. It jammed. Now go into the real pressure cooker, the Supreme War Council, known as the Big Six. After Hiroshima, they faced the unthinkable and still tried to deny it. Even with a city gone, they leaned on their own research that said atomic weapons were impossible to build. They assumed America had only one bomb, and they were wrong. The Big Six deadlocked 3-3. Their system required everyone to agree, which created a perfect trap. The peace faction wanted surrender, but with the emperor preserved. Hardliners demanded far more. They wanted Japan to handle war crimes itself, they wanted no occupation, and they wanted to keep resisting. Even as Soviet forces invaded Manchuria and 2 cities lay in ruins, military leaders like General Yoshijiro Umezu downplayed what was happening and still spoke of faith in Ketsu-go. They kept preparing for Kyūshū. They had about 560,000 soldiers deployed there already. Plans existed for as many as 28 million civilian militia to fight. They had already watched battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where about 99% and 94% of defenders respectively chose death over surrender. Internal records showed their moral shock, even while their plans stayed defiant. Declassified documents show the High Command later described the atomic destruction as beyond human morality. A 6-page Hiroshima mission report captured their stunned reaction. The 2nd General Army Headquarters near Hiroshima was destroyed, with 3,243 troops killed instantly, only about 820 meters from the hypocenter. And yet the High Command still tried to hold on. Even after massive civilian deaths from conventional bombing, later documented in the Strategic Bombing Survey, they kept arguing for resistance. Even the targeting choices mattered in their thinking. The cities selected for atomic bombing excluded Tokyo and Kyoto. Hiroshima was picked partly because of military and industrial value. The Americans were also planning a massive invasion force, so large it would have dwarfed Japan's Kyūjō defenses. Without someone breaking the deadlock, Japan's leadership could have stayed frozen by its own rules while the country burned. That outside intervention was Hirohito. This was not a normal political move. The emperor was treated as a living god, and the tradition was that he stayed above the dirty work of government and military debate. Yet, after learning of Nagasaki and the Soviet entry, Hirohito stepped forward in a decisive way. In the underground shelter conference on the night of August 9th to 10th, while the Big Six argued over surrender conditions, 1 condition or 4, Hirohito cut through it. At 2 a.m., he personally broke the 3-3 tie. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration with 1 condition: preserve the imperial throne. "We must bear the unbearable," he said. He spoke about preventing further destruction and weighed the suffering at home, including food shortages and worsening conditions. People in the room reportedly cried. Even hardened leaders wept, because defeat was now official, spoken by the one voice nobody could overrule. Hirohito's decision was also shaped by fear of what this new bomb meant for civilization itself. The enemy's weapon threatened destruction on a scale that could, if war continued, completely destroy human civilization. So surrender was reframed not as weakness, but as survival. Soon after, Hirohito told his family on August 12th that Japan would accept the Potsdam terms, pointing to the will of the people. On August 15th, he made the dual-voice broadcast, the first time a Japanese emperor addressed the public directly by radio to announce the end. His broadcast strangely emphasized Soviet entry into the war more than the atomic weapons. 2 days later, he issued an even more direct message to the military. In his August 17th rescript, he told officers and soldiers who might want to resist that they must bear the unbearable. He warned that continuing the fight risked the empire's existence after the introduction of atomic weapons. He invoked duty to ancestors while acknowledging the horror of the new bomb, turning surrender into patriotic obedience and preventing wider rebellion. Those words also silenced the hardliners in a brutal way. Bear the unbearable became some of the most powerful words in modern Japanese history, because it turned surrender from shame into imperial duty. When the emperor said surrender would preserve the foundation of the nation, military leaders lost the moral ground to keep fighting. Loyal units quickly suppressed armed dissent. Officers who had pushed Kyūjō plans now faced a stark choice: obey the emperor or become traitors to the very system they claimed to defend. But here's the part most people miss. The decision to surrender had been made. It still had to survive the night. The war was over on paper. The emperor had made his decision. The cabinet had moved toward accepting the Potsdam terms. But Japan still wasn't safe from Japan. Because on the night of August 14, 1945, a group of young army officers decided they would rather stage a coup than live with surrender. And they weren't planning a speech. They were planning to steal the emperor himself, destroy the recording of his message, and force the country to keep fighting, no matter what it cost. This is the story of the Kyūjō Incident. It's the night the war almost didn't end. Late on August 14th, NHK sound technicians were brought into the Imperial Palace to record the emperor's surrender message. It wasn't a live broadcast. It had to be recorded on a phonograph record first, then played the next day at noon. The setting wasn't a grand hall. It was an office bunker under the Imperial Household Ministry. Microphones were set up. The technicians waited. And then Emperor Hirohito spoke, quietly. So quietly, the first take was judged too soft. On the advice of the technicians, he recorded it again. The second recording became the official version, and the first was kept as a backup. Two recordings now existed, two physical objects that could end the war. And that meant two targets. Not far away, Major Kenji Hatanaka was running out of time. He was one of the officers who could not accept surrender. To him, stopping the broadcast wasn't just politics, it was saving the nation from dishonor. So he gathered allies, hunted support, and built a plan that depended on one big gamble. If he seized the palace, the rest of the army might follow. But most senior leaders were not joining. War Minister General Korechika Anami was the man the plotters desperately wanted on their side. He opposed surrender, but he would not openly bless treason. He would not say the words the rebels needed. So the young officers moved forward anyway, hoping they could fake momentum and force the army to fall in behind them. Now picture the palace grounds that night. It's dark. It's tense. Everyone knows something huge is coming the next day. Guards are posted. Doors are locked. Phones ring and stop. Around 9:30 p.m., Hatanaka and his group put their plan into motion. They pushed into the palace area using Imperial Guard troops. They talked fast. They acted like everything was official. They told lies that sounded like orders, claiming top commanders were on board when they weren't. Their goal was simple to say and hard to do. Control the palace, isolate the emperor, and find the recordings. But first, they needed one man. Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori was commander of the Imperial Guards Division. If Mori backed them, the coup could look legal. If he opposed them, the Guard could crush them. Hatanaka confronted him. Mori refused. And in that moment, the coup crossed a line it could never uncross. Hatanaka murdered Mori. Another officer killed Mori's brother-in-law in the same burst of violence. Those were the only murders that night, but they were enough. The rebels then used Mori's official stamp to forge orders that made it look like the guards were acting under proper authority. Now the palace was in rebel hands, at least on the surface. Palace police were disarmed. Entrances were blocked. People were detained, including staff, and even NHK workers connected to the recording and broadcast. And yet the rebels still had the same problem. They were inside the palace, but they didn't control the palace. Because the palace wasn't just rooms and hallways, it was layers, corridors, Underground spaces, locked chambers, hidden vaults. Even people who worked there could get lost. And the people who wanted the surrender broadcast to happen understood something the coup leaders didn't. If you hide the recording well enough, the coup becomes useless. Somewhere in that maze, the two records were moved and concealed. The rebels began searching for them like men hunting for a ghost. They also searched for key officials, including Privy Seal Koichi Kido, because Kido was the gatekeeper of the emperor's decision. If they could find him, they could break the chain of command around Hirohito. But Kido and others were already hidden deep inside the palace in a secure underground chamber. So the rebels searched blind. Every minute they didn't find the records, the next day got closer. Midnight came. Then the hours before dawn. And at noon, the entire country was supposed to hear the emperor speak. The rebels tried to expand their control beyond the palace too. They wanted the radio stations. They wanted NHK. They wanted a microphone to tell the nation, "Don't listen, don't surrender." Hatanaka even tried to persuade General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, to support the coup. Tanaka refused. He told Hatanaka to go home. Hatanaka ignored him, because ignoring him was the only way the coup could keep breathing. Inside the palace, the search continued. Doors opened, rooms checked, corridors crossed again and again. The rebels were hunting for two records they had never seen, in a place they didn't fully understand, while the people hiding those records knew every trick the palace could offer. At some point, the records were successfully smuggled out of the palace area. Accounts described the two discs carried out in simple containers, one in a lacquer box, the other in something as ordinary as a lunch bag. It sounds almost silly until you realize that lunch bag may have helped end the war. By now, the coup's biggest weakness was showing. It never became a national uprising. It stayed a pocket of chaos. Hatanaka had hoped that once the palace was occupied, the larger army would rise up. But most commanders did not move. Many officers may have hated surrender, but they feared one thing even more: disobeying the emperor's will. And then morning came. At dawn, General Tanaka learned what was happening inside the palace. He went there in person. He confronted the rebel officers face to face. He berated them. He made it clear they were breaking the spirit of the army and breaking the emperor's command. Slowly, the rebellion began to collapse. By about 8 a.m., the coup was being dismantled. The rebels had held key palace grounds for much of the night, but they failed at the one thing that mattered. They never found the recordings. Hatanaka tried one last move. He went to NHK and demanded airtime. If he could get on the radio before noon, maybe he could still twist the moment. Maybe he could call for resistance. Maybe he could claim the surrender was fake. But he was blocked. He was ordered to stop. The army around him was no longer pretending. The plot was dying in daylight. Hatanaka and another key conspirator, Jiro Shizaki, left behind leaflets explaining their motives. But leaflets can't stop a broadcast. They can't stop a record already in motion. Near midday, before the emperor's voice went on air, Hatanaka took his own life. Shizaki did the same. The coup ended the way many desperate wartime stories ended in Japan, not with a trial, but with self-destruction. And one more thread snapped that morning. In the early hours of August 15th, War Minister General Anami committed ritual suicide. He left a short note that, in meaning, reads like an apology to the emperor, with my death, for a great crime. People still argue about what he meant by that crime: supporting war too long, failing to prevent treason, or simply living through surrender at all. But the message was clear. The army's most powerful hardliner was not going to lead a new war inside Japan. Before that, Anami had shown strict discipline once the emperor decided. He instructed his brother-in-law, Takeshita, to abandon any coup plans. He told assembled officers they must bear the unbearable, using the emperor's exact words. He told them to accept surrender even if it meant eating grass and sleeping on stones. That loyalty to the throne helped undercut the conspirators at the exact moment they needed support most. Now the country moved toward noon. All over Japan that morning, people heard the emperor would speak at 12 p.m. Many dressed formally. Some stood by radios like it was a funeral. Others stood like it was Judgment Day. Most had never heard the emperor's voice in their entire lives. At exactly noon, NHK began. An announcer told the nation this was a message of the highest importance. The anthem played. Then the record turned, and the voice came out. Not a general, not a politician, not a radio host. The emperor. The audio quality was poor. The language was formal and hard to follow. Many listeners were confused at first because the speech did not plainly say, "We surrender," in simple words. Even so, the meaning hit like a weight when people understood. Japan was accepting the Potsdam Declaration. The war was ending. Afterward, to reduce confusion, a radio announcer explained what the message meant. Japan was surrendering. And that was the strangest part of this whole story. The biggest war Japan had ever fought did not end because a fort was taken, or a fleet was sunk, or a city fell. It ended because two fragile recordings survived one violent night inside a palace. A lunch bag beat a coup. A hidden vault beat rifles. And a voice, captured on a record, crossed a country at noon and made the fighting stop. But even then, the danger wasn't over. Because once that broadcast ended, Japan still had to do something even harder than surrendering in words. It had to surrender in reality. And in the days that followed, millions of armed men had to obey the message, not fight it. The empire had to keep order, troops had to stand down, and the Allies had to arrive without triggering new explosions of violence.